Hi everyone, hope you're having a good day so far. This Module 13 lecture is over presentation aids, how to make them, how to use them. There are a few different elements within your delivery that you need to consider when you're using this type of presentation aid. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about using a presentation software, and the biggest thing with this is the focus should be on your speech, and you should focus on your speech even if you're planning to use a presentation aid, because the PowerPoint or the visual aid that you're using is more of a supplement, not a replacement for your presentation. Primarily, you want your audience to be listening to you and engaging with you and delivering your speech in a way that entertains them or persuades them or informs them, as we've been learning about. Even if you're using a PowerPoint or something like that, you don't want their eyes to constantly be looking and reading and taking in your slides. Rather, you want them to glance over when you offer up some content and then back to you. As always, it's very important to develop a plan, and so when using a presentation aid, always begin with your speaking outline, and this just means write your speech first, focus on the speech's content first and foremost, and then allow the presentation aid to act as a sort of supplement to it, an extra thing that will up the ante for your speech. Next, you should consider whether or not points require visual aids. Of course, we don't want every single point to come with some sort of image or chart or graph or something like that. I mean, not every single bullet point. Perhaps you have a content switch on every single main point, for instance. That might be good. But basically, the rule is less is more. You want to scale it down so that the audience isn't constantly focused on your presentation aid. Next, you should decide how many slides you're going to need, or roughly how many slides you're going to need at least, just so that you have developed a plan for how long your presentation is going to be and exactly when you'll be switching slides, for instance. And lastly, you should determine how to arrange your slides effectively. So going off of that speaking outline, look at where there are breaks. Look at where you want to emphasize certain pieces of information. That's going to tell you where you need to switch slides or point the audience's attention towards your presentation aid in order to guide them through the presentation and keep them engaged all the way through. One thing that might come up when dealing with presentation aids is copyright infringement. That's a big scary phrase to me with lots of legalities attached, so let's just avoid that at all costs. You should always try to abide by audio, video copyright restrictions, just so that you're not possibly profiting off of another artist's work or photographer's or researcher's work. You should recognize when fair use provisions apply. So there's this law called fair use that applies to certain types of media, where if you just use a snippet of a song or a video or something like that, then those snippets don't necessarily fall under copyright law, and therefore you don't need to acquire any certain rights for that from the artist or from the content creator. As always, cite the source of your material, not only in your verbal citations throughout the speech, but it could be a matter of putting a little caption underneath the photo, telling the audience where you got that photo or video or chart or graph or anything like that. So these can come in the form of oral citations like we've been learning about, or written citations if they're on a PowerPoint slide. When in doubt, it's always acceptable to contact TTU's Information Technology Office, or like even a department in the IMCOM that works with the IT department. They'll often know the communication that is required for copyrighted information, or whether or not some piece of media falls under fair use provisions. So always use that resource if you feel that you need it. And with all of these things, you can avoid serious consequences for improper acquisition. Now let's move on to the more fun part about presentation aids, which is designing them. The first thing you should know is that it's better to keep the design simple. Again, less is more, so avoid flooding your slides with text. This is because if there are just walls and paragraphs of text on each of your slides, the audience is certainly going to be more concerned with reading off every word of your slide rather than focusing on you and the engaging delivery that you've developed for your speech. So a good rule of thumb is to follow the 6x6 rule. That means limit 6 words per line and then 6 lines per slide. As you can see, this slide in particular that you're looking at follows the 6x6 rule. However, it's certainly a little bit dull. I didn't design this PowerPoint. If I did, I would include some images and some fun stuff, but you can see that it's very consistent and it's very simple and it's easy to look at and engage with, I guess. However, it is a little bit boring. It's a lot of white space, so just know that when we're designing PowerPoints, we want to keep them simple, but we also want to make them more image heavy than text heavy. If you can fill one of your slides with just an image and then provide context for that image within your speech, that's always better than perhaps, writing a bunch of sentences on a PowerPoint slide. Another good idea is to use design elements consistently. Follow consistent design decisions for presentation aids and PowerPoints especially. So every slide should look somewhat similar. They should all be coordinated in terms of your background design and your font usage, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. This is because consistency helps prevent distraction. So if an audience is constantly trying to figure out where you're going with the design of your PowerPoint, then they might get a little confused and distracted. So if every single slide has a different crazy font that they're trying to read or a different palette of colors that they're trying to take in, then it takes away from your message a little bit. Furthermore, you should use consistent design elements in each presentation aid. So this would be in an example of like if you were giving several presentations at work over the coming months, and so you're holding meetings about sort of the same project, but different parts of the project, then you would want to make each of those presentation aids sort of tie together in their design and in their formatting so that as all together they work as a cohesive project and you keep that professionalism up and that speaker credibility up if you're coming into each meeting with a well-prepared, well-designed, and consistent formatting across all of your presentations. Let's move on to selecting appropriate fonts. So a typeface is defined by a specific style of lettering. It's available in many fonts, so point sizes. Typically, you're going to want to go for something on a PowerPoint. The title is going to be, 36 points or higher, whereas the actual content or any text in the body of the PowerPoint slide should be probably 14 or 16, or maybe even higher, depending on how much text you have there on the slide. There are two major categories of fonts. The first is serif. You see this in like Times New Roman and fonts like that, where there are small little flourishes, I guess that's what they're called, on the ends of letters. So you'll see a T and it has little tails at the top and at the bottom, right? And these are typically used for written word, but not necessarily multimedia or like electronic media. Typically sans serif is best. This font that you're seeing here is a sans serif because it doesn't have any of those little flourishes and it's more block-like and linear. Therefore, it's easier to read from further distances and in a larger audience of people. So especially on digital formats like PowerPoint, you're going to want to use sans serif fonts. Note that you should use boldface, underlining, and italics very sparingly. If everything is bolded or underlined or italicized, then your audience is going to be trying to figure out what all of those emphases mean, right? So what parts are underlined, why does that matter, stuff like that. So just keep it simple. If you really want to emphasize a portion of text, then bold, underlined, or italic, whatever seems appropriate. And but again, just use it seldomly and use it less is more style. You should also try to use color very carefully in your PowerPoint slides. Used effectively, color can potentially set the mood of a presentation. If it's a little bit darker and moodier, maybe darker, more jewel-toned colors. If it's a little bit brighter, maybe more pastels and lighter colors. And used effectively, color can make things easier to see or make certain pieces of information or certain media pop more, whereas poor color choices can set the wrong mood that you weren't going for or anticipating, and it can render images or text unattractive or unreadable. So I'm sure you've all experienced this when a student gets up and, displays their presentation and it has a red background, and it probably looked great on their computer, but once it's up on the big screen, you can barely read the text that's over that red background. And that same thing can happen with fonts that don't contrast enough with the background color, and images that aren't corrected or displayed correctly. So all of this stuff can be big benefiters or downplayers of your presentation. It's just going to depend. If you can, display your PowerPoint before you speak, like long before you speak if you have some rehearsal time or something, just to make sure everything stays formatted correctly from your computer to that big screen. Now let's go over speaking with presentations and what changes you might have to make to your delivery in order to accommodate a presentation aid. Here are some benefits of using presentation aids. One, it helps listeners process and retain information. Many people are visual learners. I certainly am a visual learner, and so I always feel comforted if a speaker has also brought along a presentation aid, some kind of visual thing that I can look at as a supplement to their speech. It can also convey information in a time-saving fashion, a picture's worth 1,000 words type of thing, and sometimes you have to admit that images just communicate a little bit better than our words do. And perhaps you don't have so much time to describe a certain setting or describe a certain person. It's better to just display an image of that setting or person. It can also enhance your image of professionalism. If you come into a speaking engagement and you've also prepared a great looking visual aid, then the audience thinks, wow, they're really going for it, and I'm happy that this person put so much work into their presentation. And also it can just spark extra interest. Sometimes just listening to someone speak can be a bit boring, and so in order to elevate your presentation a little bit, putting a visual aid or any kind of presentation aid up there can be really helpful and engaging to your audience. In our class, the focus on presentation aids is mostly on PowerPoint software. However, there are a bunch of different types of presentation aids, so we should always try to select an appropriate visual aid for the type of presentation we're doing. And so it's going to depend. If you're an architecture major, then perhaps you want a 3D model of something. Same thing with engineering, same thing with medicine, and I'm sure a bunch of other disciplines that benefit more from like a 3D model of something, or perhaps some sort of object. There are pictures, graphs, and charts, which also can be implemented into PowerPoint presentations. Same thing with audio, video, and multimedia. And then of course we have our standbys, PowerPoint or Prezi, and other presentation aid software. I'm sure y'all know a couple other platforms that work really well for classroom speeches and even professional presentations that you might give later on. The main thing, of course, is that your presentation aid should help listeners grasp information effectively. It should engage them and help them focus in more on the concepts that you want to highlight the most. Okay, y'all, that was our Module 13 presentation on visual aids and presentation aids in particular, most likely PowerPoint for your persuasive policy speech. I'm so excited to see what y'all do visually with this speech, and the PowerPoints helped me so much in imagining what you were going for in the speech and how you wanted your audience to react to your content. So put a lot into those, work really hard on these PowerPoints. I'm excited to see them, and I hope y'all are doing well. Contact me if you need anything. Bye.